Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. This Thursday night, we focus on human rights and economic rights. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa is the highest law of the land and represents our social contract as a people. It defines the court's commitment to fulfilling the constitutional vision of transformation from socio-economic deprivation to equitable distribution of national economic resources, with the aim of advancing the welfare of all in our country. Now, Human Rights Month is commemorated in March to remind South Africans about the sacrifices that accompanied the struggle for the attainment of democracy in South Africa. Human Rights Day on the 21st of March falls within this period. This year, we commemorate Human Rights Month under the theme, the Year of Unity, Socio-Economic Renewal, and Nation Building. Good evening, Mzansi.
Our constitution is unique in the world in that it confers socio-economic rights. Others in the world tend to confer only civil liberties. Enforcing socio-economic rights given in the constitution has been a challenge in our country. So, why did the architects of our noble constitution include socio-economic rights and afford them constitutional recognition?
Yes, Nana. It is worth reflecting on the Constitution at this moment precisely in our country's history in light of Fees Must Fall 2.0 and in light of the recent assertions by 200 powerful organizations and leading individuals that the national budget of 2021 that saw significant cuts in the areas of social spending is unconstitutional.
Yes, we will hear later from the Financial and Fiscal Commission's Michael Sachs and the Budget Justice Coalition on the issue of constitutionality, or the lack thereof of our latest budget.
Yes, we did dip into a discussion where Michael Sachs did make some comments this afternoon. Now back to the Constitution, whose preamble outlines the historical context that sets the pace for the transformative vision of this country. It provides that the Constitution was adopted to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights.
It sought to lay the foundations of a democratic and open society in which the government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by and equal under the law. And importantly, improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person.
The South African Constitution establishes a parliamentary structure for the national government and allocates powers to the provincial governments. It also allocates a constitutional court with 11 justices who are appointed to serve 12-year non-renewable terms. The first group of justices was impressive as it included an international war crimes prosecutor, several former law professors, and the attorney who founded the nation's leading civil rights litigation firm and represented President Nelson Mandela during his imprisonment. The South African Constitution provides a good framework where it sets out to the government's obligations to its people. The South African Constitution also says that the government has obligations to transform the economy into one that doesn't discriminate. It also protects and dignifies the people of South Africa, where it also improves the standards of living. South Africa adopted its constitution in 1996. The Constitutional Court issued the second certification judgment, ruling that the constitution compiled with the 34 constitutional principles agreed upon in political negotiations that took place from 1991 to 1993. For many years, there has been a debate about whether social and economic rights belong in a constitution. The debate has occurred with special intensity in both Eastern Europe and South Africa. The American Constitution and most constitutions before the 20th century protected such rights as free speech, religious liberty, and sanctity of the home. In the past, socio-economic rights have rarely been the subject matter of constitutional law. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa has radically changed this. Not only does it feature a number of provisions guaranteeing enforceable socio-economic rights, such as the rights to have access to housing, healthcare, water and social security, the country's constitutional court has also taken up the task of providing these rights with a workable methodology for judicial review. The Constitutional Court is praiseworthy for its innovative force in rendering socio-economic rights. It is not entirely beyond reproach. Prudence Makubalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our Constitution envisages not just redressing the wrongs of the past, but promises to improve the quality of life and to free the potential of each person. The process entails transforming the socio-economic status quo bequeathed by the apartheid regime, as well as the societal imbalances generated by the present system. So, the Constitution does not only enshrine justiciable socio-economic rights, but makes provision for a comprehensive range of obligations and mechanisms related to their realization.
Sometimes politics and commerce get in the way, and public institutions are caused to veer away from constitutional obligations. It happens sometimes that the political framework becomes practically defiant in translating constitutional guarantees into real entitlements, thereby adversely affecting those whom the rights are meant to empower and to protect.
Oh, indeed, Nana. So it is necessary for the political approaches and processes to be subjected to judicial scrutiny, for citizens sometimes just to take their government and other public institutions to court to test constitutionality of the executive decision-making, perhaps, the legislative conduct of some, and the pronouncements which translates basically into the courts playing a role in social transformation and giving tangible effect to socio-economic rights. This ensures that government is responsive and accountable to its people, not just through the ballot or the democratic process of voting every 5 years, but also through litigation. I have heard, Nana, some whispers and discussions of late about litigation on the issue of the national policy, or national economic policy that is, and the budget. Have you heard such tea, Nana?
No, Tandeka, but I am looking forward to the discussions that you'll have with the guests about how South Africans can ensure that public bodies adhere to the Constitution.
But before that, Nana, former head of the Budget Office at National Treasury, Michael Sachs, has once again reiterated his view that this year's budget, which was tabled by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni in Parliament last month, may be unconstitutional. Sachs first made the comments last week when he addressed members of Parliament's Finance Portfolio Committee, where he was speaking in his capacity as the chairperson of the Financial and Fiscal Commission, a statutory body which is mandated to advise the government on the country's fiscal framework and intergovernmental relations. Today, he doubled down on the comments when he took part in a panel discussion of the ANC's Mkhabulo Roundtable on Economic Transformation and Prosperity, hosted by the ruling party this afternoon, and party head of policy, Jeff Radebe. Sachs called the deep and wide-ranging budget cuts to government spending on social services, including health and education, as a direct assault on the economic well-being of the poor African majority in South Africa.
Now we have, so you'll hear people in the economic world talking about policy inconsistency. It's a very polite term and it sounds like a very small thing, but now I want to say that the policy inconsistency has reached crisis proportions, because we have now tabled a budget, and this goes back to what Comrade Jeff was asking at the beginning about, in my capacity as the chair of the FFC, the Finance and Fiscal Commission, we tabled a comment before Parliament saying, this budget that has been tabled, however we slice it, it means a significant, real erosion of the value of those public services that I've been talking about, of healthcare, public healthcare, basic education, and criminal justice. And of huge proportions over the next 3 years. And the sad truth is that even if we implement that budget, we will still not resolve the rise in debt that South Africa faces. We will still be increasingly indebting ourselves. And so there's now a fundamental policy inconsistency at the heart of government and at the heart of the ANC. And we saw it on the streets today, where we have the ANC and some saying our policy is to extend free basic education. The ANC and the government also saying there's not money for free basic education. We're going to see the same thing breaking out all over the next few years. It might not be this year, but the budget implies a contraction in the provision of services. And those services, by the way, those public services that I've been describing constitute a very large share of the income and consumption of the core constituency of the ANC, meaning the poor African masses, if I can put it like that.
Yesterday, over 200 NGOs, community-based organizations and trade unions petitioned Parliament to reject the budget, also calling the severe austerity measures contained in it unconstitutional. On Zoom now, I'm joined by Dr. Ntabiseng Moliko, development economist at Stellenbosch Business School or the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Welcome, Ntabiseng. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, and a very good evening.
Ntabi, what do you make of the open letter? I assume you've read the open letter of the 200 organizations because it's such a significant development. What do you make of the open letter on the issue of socio-economic rights and the budget of 2021?
Well, let me start with the budget. I think for me, in terms of really the budget cuts, which is the primary source of contention. So what I understand from the budget now is the Minister of Finance in the budget review has outlined that there is a primary deficit that we currently have that will be moved from the existing budget deficit that we have, which is around 14% year on year to 2023-24 to a 0.8% level. What that simply means is that the bulk of our expenditure across your learning and culture, social development, and healthcare will be reduced as a proportion of GDP. So that letter is speaking to the budget cuts of approximately almost 265 billion over the next 3 years. So this simply means for the country that we are going to cut 67 billion from public health, we're going to cut 9 billion from public schooling, we're going to cut 36 billion from social grants in real terms. And it's important to note that. So that you get to that surplus that the National Treasury is targeting to reduce the expenditure. So that's number one. I think the second thing is that the consolidated non-interest expenditure or the revenue that will be spent on an annual real level will show that in terms of the public expenditure, we will be spending less on real public investment as a proportion of GDP over time. And this has been the case. I think the Professor Michael Sachs actually pointed that out quite clearly in terms of how that actually takes place. I think the concern, therefore, is that what effect will this have on the social and the economic structure of South Africa, number one? And what effect will this have on the likelihood of us to grow and the socioeconomic rights of most South Africans who are reliant on, because of our historical disposition,
you've just taken You've just taken the words out of my mouth, as that was my next question to you. What do you think the effect on growth, as well as on the socioeconomic profile of the country, as well as people's socioeconomic rights would be?
So I think the real concern is that, Thandeka, the real concern, if you look at the effect of the budget cuts, there's two things you need to look at. Is the budget cut going to help us grow? I think that's the primary question.
Yeah.
So will the effect of the budget cut not erode our ability to grow?
Yeah.
And I think that's the real debate that's happening from an economic perspective. As you reduce the budget, the fiscal multiplier is reduced. In effect, it causes, and this is what a lot of econometric literature is showing, is that in a recession, because you have a contracting investment, you have a contracting trade surplus, you have a contracting government expenditure and household aggregate demand, i.e. consumption. Usually the fiscal stimulus, which comes through the government fiscus, to stimulate all of those aggregate demands from the household, from SMMEs, because they use public procurement into infrastructure and other services to stimulate growth. So what the effect on growth has been projected by National Treasury is that growth will be 3% for this current year. Will that be adequate on the social economic impact on the ground? Remember, if we go back to where we are, South Africans, per capita GDP, as recently shown by Stats SA, is gone back to levels where we were in 2005. Annual growth has gone back to pre-1946 levels.
And it's
so
important
we actually had a contraction of 7%.
Yeah.
So all this effect is actually going to put us on a really dampening and a lackluster growth.
And it's important to point out that per capita incomes have been declining year on year since the post-apartheid period. And that's a damning indictment on the ruling party and its ability to manage this economy in the interests of its people.
I think the real issue, Thandeka, in addition to that, is that poverty, more than 50% of our people are in poverty. We're in an unemployment crisis of 42.6%. What we have to deal with is how do we get out? The policy reforms that we are seeing to grow ourselves, I think the focus cannot only be on expenditure cutting. We've got to look at how do we enhance our revenue projections and our revenue collections. So Treasury collects from PAYE, VAT, and company income tax. The majority come from your income tax. So that means that your people need to have actual income. They need to be employed so that you can reinvigorate and deal with the issue of the budget deficit, so that you increase your revenue that you collect. And that comes from increasing output and increasing revenue. And so I think the main focus should be on that, but we're not seeing that from a policy perspective. And I think the focus is too much on the expenditure side and not necessarily dealing with the serious critical problems we have on the economic reforms and the serious structural problems that the economy has. And I think that's where we need to put our effort and our thinking caps on so that we can see a real change in the transition and the growth path that South Africa currently is on.
Now let's get back to socioeconomic rights and the grinding poverty and what's likely to be the case in the years that unfold. Why would our government set us on a course that will not yield growth nor live up to the promise of the Constitution?
That's an interesting question. I think this is what we are pondering as we look at the alternatives, because many economists, not even now with the letter that's coming from civil society, from academics, from grassroots movements. Last year, economists wrote to the president and said, and made an appeal that the measures that are being taken from an economic policy perspective, particularly in a time of recession, need to be reviewed. I think that what is happening is that National Treasury, because they are really the heartbeat of economic policy, have taken the space. And I think the space on economic policy, they've decided that 3% growth is adequate, 1.9% next year, and 1% the year after that. And I think that what needs to happen is we have to enter into a discussion to ask ourselves, what are the real alternatives that we need to look at so that we propel the economy? It is possible that in their economic modeling, the constraints that they have put in place haven't sufficiently dealt and looked at alternatives. And when I talk about alternatives, I'm talking about one, the focus on debt to GDP and the focus on soliciting funds from multilateral agencies. We have a capital market surplus of more than 8 trillion. It's positive that we're hearing about Regulation 28 reforms, but I must say there's not enough emphasis on investment and using domestic resource mobilization. We're not looking at how we invest into frontier products, investing in industrialization so we can enhance economic activity, employ more of our people in these labor absorptive sectors, but also use our capital market surpluses as other countries have done, using the PIC, the Government Employment Pension Fund, in an asset class. You even have, Thandeka, what we call surpluses on the UIF and the compensation fund. These are not being used to invest into productive investment, not into consumptive type behavior. So these will then generate economic activity. So you increase your PAYE collections, your VAT collections, which are the bulk of our revenue for the budget surplus that Treasury is targeting. So I think we need to rewire some of the discussion and rather look at what are the solutions?
Alternatives.
How can we resolve? Yes, we've got to look at alternatives.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on Economics Unbound. Now let's take a small break. Welcome back. Atop the city of Johannesburg, on a hill, sits the highest court in the land. Once a place of physical brutality and a jail, it now stands as the embodiment of the South African Constitution. But despite the Constitution guaranteeing socioeconomic rights and cultural rights, statistics indicate that such rights remain elusive and out of reach for the majority of South Africans. Yet some South African luminaries in business, academia, and politics remain hopeful that the Constitution is that lone star that holds much promise.
I think that we as South Africans sometimes don't really know what we've got. And one of the things that we've got is a world-class constitution. And yet many South Africans have never even read the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of South Africa, very few people actually understand the protections that come with the Constitution. And it's something that I think, and certainly the last 5 years that I've been working with the Constitutional Hill Trust, has opened my eyes to the possibilities and the potential of the Constitution being a savior for South Africa. You know, it's a world-class Constitution. And I think that we as South Africans must open it, must read it, must study it. And it's simple. It's a very, very simple document, the preamble. But it's so comforting. And it is world class. We have it is a constitution that people from around the world come and study our South African Constitution.
The most important thing that the Constitution says about education is that all children have a right to an education. And I've always been very clear about interpreting that to mean all. It doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not, it doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor, you have a right to an education. And the question becomes, how do we make sure that we serve our children by giving them that education that is their right?
I think South Africa is at what I would refer to as an inflection point. You know, inflection points are those points where when we move forward, we can either go into a negative state or in a positive state. And we have got such a progressive constitution. I think that if we really look at the spirit of the Constitution, it binds us together. But it only does that if each one of us align ourselves to it and understand that we are all agents of that Constitution. It doesn't matter where we are in our different spheres of influence. And I would say in particular for those, I think some people find it a lot easier because they're the ones struggling, they see where the Constitution can help them.
Of our history, we moved away from a parliamentary democracy to a constitutional democracy, which has the Bill of Rights and other laws which can protect all South Africans equally, fairly, and justly so. And I think we need the Constitution to ensure that we deliver on the mandate of our people. For instance, in the preamble of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, we talk of redressing the imbalances of the past. Now, redressing the imbalances of the past means investing more on social issues of your people, be it education, be it health, be it roads, be it infrastructure, but equally ensure that you broaden the participation of those who were previously excluded from your constitution to participate as part of ensuring that we redress the imbalances of the past, as it is said in the preamble of our constitution.
On Zoom now, I'm joined by Shaila Kyla from the hashtag Pay the Grants campaign from Johannesburg. Hi, Kyla. Hi, Shaila.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
It's Shaira.
I hope you've been following the discussion thus far and can easily jump in. But my first question is, you were party to the open letter. And you asked in the open letter the parliamentarians in the Appropriations Committee to review the budget and to perhaps consider sending it back for redo by National Treasury. Why?
Yes, I mean, I think that in this moment of mourning, particularly seeing what's happening across the country, I spent some of the day with students on campus, and I could feel the pain of losing an innocent human life in the fight for your right to freedom of association, your right to protest, your right to housing, to education, and to dignity. And I send my sincere condolences to Mtokozisi Ntumba's family and his loved ones. He was murdered by our police, and he was not the first to be killed in this manner at our universities. Beyond just universities, though, people are killed at service delivery protests. People are killed at worker strikes, and people are killed demanding for freer and fairer society. And this demand for our leaders and parliamentarians and representatives to rethink this budget is closely tied to what is unfolding in the country right now.
But why rethink the budget? What about the budget concerns you? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm getting to those points. Thank you. I was told we had 8 minutes to present our case. Sorry,
okay.
I missed the floor.
All right.
So it is as if our leaders live in a different world entirely. And this detachment from reality on the ground is also reflected in the budget. Minister Tito Mboweni said in a very self-gratifying way that this is a historical victory. And the same budget has slashed social grants and education and healthcare by an unprecedented 265 billion rand over the next 3 years. And it's reduced taxes on the wealthy in the middle of a once-in-a-century global pandemic. The fact that this moment is as it is stands to show that our leaders are being blinded by conservative economic orthodoxies while ignoring our social, economic, and humanitarian realities. And by doing this, they are reneging on their own constitutional obligations. Our government has ignored well-researched global economic analysis showing that budget cuts to social spending in times of suffering are shown only to push a country further into a downward spiral. Budget cuts to social spending will not deal with our debt. There are real alternatives to this. And if our leaders were less focused on gaslighting us on Twitter, while their children are hunted like animals in the next street, maybe these alternatives could be entertained. So let me go into some of the real issues.
Can you confine yourself to the alternatives? Let's discuss mainly the alternatives.
I just want to finish my point. Thank you.
This is a discussion. We have to be more in a discussion mode. This is a discussion with me on behalf of the viewers. Perhaps we could contain it to and focus on alternatives and real suggestions as to the direction we could take as a people.
Okay, there are three things that I want to point out to contextualize what my alternatives will be based on. The first is that the average South African CEO takes home as much as 461 Black women from the bottom 10% of earners in the country. The second is that only 5% of all African and colored youth enter and successfully complete university. NSFAS is failing at supporting the people it should be. And in terms of funding, beyond just funding, we also need to look at the psychosocial support that is needed at a university and higher education level if we are to create the critical skills that this country needs. Lastly, we see that the budget reduces spending on public health by an unprecedented 50.3 billion rand over the next 3 years. And the allocation to COVID-19 vaccines has come at the expense of other vital health services, including HIV/AIDS and TB programs, rather than from a small increase in taxes, which is one of the alternatives that I'm suggesting. And when we desperately need skills, we've seen cuts in higher education spending to bail out SAA. These realities are unacceptable, and this is partly why we've been asking parliamentarians to reject this budget. If we look at social grants, they have been cut by an approximate 36 billion rand. The 500 rand top-ups to caregivers were removed in October last year, and in November, the NITS-CRAM analysis showed that 1 in 6 households with children reported that a child had gone hungry last week. In this formulation, women are not only expected to take care of children, but are actually punished for being caregivers. The Gender Commission expressed how vital the grants are for women, especially women facing GBV. And if the government is to put its money where its mouth is, and it is not its money, it is the people's money, then we do need to reinstate the COVID grant, or at the very least, extend the COVID grant beyond October and include caregivers who are currently excluded.
I was going to ask you, what would be the bare skeleton, or what would be the architecture of a grant system that you would consider adequate?
I think the main point with our current grant system is that it is built on the myth of a deserving poor. And the conditions that are often put into place that are embedded in the system to access these grants end up excluding just as many people that as they include quite a few. So even if we look at the COVID grant, we saw that there were 9 million people who applied for it in a matter of months. This was the first time that people between the ages of 18 and 59 could actually be given assistance by our social system, even though for the longest time unemployment has been structural and poverty has been systemic. That is a fundamental problem. If we look at the biggest challenge that our leaders face right now, I think it's that they're being driven by fear rather than by imagination. And the austerity budget exists because we fear the very strings that control the political and economic status quo, which has birthed the mind-numbing inequality that I started off with. So holistically, what we really need is to build an inclusive economy. And this means that we're open to creativity and coordination, and including civil society in these discussions. So a no-brainer, and one of the alternatives that I'm pushing for, is the demand for basic income guarantee. The merits of a basic income guarantee have been well documented. And contrary to stereotypes of laziness, grants have actually been important in supporting job seeking, for example, by paying for childcare or transport for caregivers, or to buy stock and establish small businesses. And what we do with the Pay the Grants campaign is that we use the term guarantee over grant, because it is a guarantee to everyone's moral and social right to the economy. This approach frames the basic income in a way that allows us to understand the permanent and universal character of every person's right to food security, to help them access other rights such as healthcare and schooling. But we also need an equally urgent focus on universal basic services, lest we see people using their grants to buy things like clean water, which should be a guarantee.
And there is the argument from the authorities that there is simply not enough money. What's your answer to that one?
My answer to that is that affordability is a matter of political will. Let me take you through some figures. If we were to implement an annual progressive wealth tax of between 3 and 7%, we could raise 143 billion rand. A 10% increase in personal income tax on the top 2% of earners could raise up to 40 billion rand. Anti-tax avoidance and anti-corruption measures would, of course, need to be put into place for this to be substantially reinforced. But we also could think of a guaranteed basic income that could be financed through new or increased corporate taxes and a natural resource or carbon tax. So to say that there are no options is simply an excuse that we cannot afford to have at this time.
So what options do you have for future action if the government does not move in the direction of alternatives that you suggest?
There are protests being planned, but we also understand that it is a very difficult time to be on the ground right now. Colleagues that will speak after me, including Comrade Dominic Brown, will go into more detail on that. But I wanted to just end on this important point that a basic income, which is one of the alternatives that I focused on, is not a silver bullet. It will not solve inequality and poverty, but it can allow us time and give us some stability so that we can organize and build towards a better world. While growing the economy by reducing debt has been the core focus of the executive, it's very clear to us that the state has lost sight of what the economy is for. It is for improving the lives of all in South Africa. And we need to join the people in refusing to be driven by fear and rather being driven by imagination and realizing a freer and fairer world with our fists raised in the air as we...
I was going to say that on the note of a better world and envisaging future action and watching what will come of that in your space, we need to end the discussion so that I can move on with Zweli Nzimavavi and other guests. Thank you so much for sharing those alternatives with us, as well as what a future grant dispensation could look like, anchored by the Universal Basic Income Grant. Thanks so much. Now, civil society organizations, together with some trade unions and social movements, are calling on Parliament, as we have said before, to reject the cuts in the budget that was tabled by Minister Tito Mboweni recently. They say the budget, which sets out deep cuts to government spending on social services over the next 3 years, is unconstitutional.
A budget like no other before. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced wide-ranging cuts on almost everything from education, health and even social grants. Altogether, the budget cuts will amount to around 265 billion rand over the next 3 years. Now, as students from Johannesburg's Wits University took to the streets to protest against the cut of around 800 million rand to the Department of Higher Education's funding for universities this year, civil society organizations called on Parliament not to approve Minister Mboweni's budget. They say it will negatively impact the majority of people in the country who are poor and is therefore unconstitutional.
In the budget speech, the finance minister said about 3 or 4 times that this is not an austerity budget. But I've read every page, 250 pages of that budget, and everywhere it says that every page has got elements of austerity in it. And on page 35 of that document, they say that spending, non-interest spending over the next 3 years will decline. I think it's by 5.2% a year. And if you add population growth, that's about 6.6% a year. So real per capita non-interest spending will decline by about 6.6% a year. There's no precedence in the post-apartheid period for such vicious cuts to government spending. And unfortunately, Nompu, we know that when austerity has there's only one outcome from austerity. It is political instability and rising debt ratio.
The organizations have accused Mboweni of placing the burden of fiscal consolidation on the poor and the working class while handing out tax breaks to the corporate sector and the rich. This in reaction to Mboweni's announcement in the budget that the corporate tax rate will be lowered from 28% to 27%.
South Africa should not be reducing the corporate income tax rate. There's a lot of evidence that has shown that cutting the corporate income tax rates does not give the returns and investments that are expected. And in fact, all it's done is increase inequality. And this is from an UNCTAD study that took place and was released 2019 to show what had happened after the financial crisis. And so there's a tendency to want to cut taxes as a way to garner investment, but we'd argue strongly against that notion. But also we've put forward in the past multiple other measures that can be implemented given our tax structure. For instance, a wealth tax in South Africa is long overdue.
Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Finance today began deliberating on this year's budget. The committee has the power to approve, amend or reject the budget. How it will respond to the call to reject the budget remains to be seen. Bongeni Muchwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
The Portfolio Committee on Higher Education has condemned the killing of a bystander when police shot at Wits students who were protesting in Johannesburg today. Yesterday, the news of the shooting incident came while the Portfolio Committee was in a meeting with the Department of Higher Education and Training discussing the shortfall in funding for tertiary students who are beneficiaries of the National Students Finance Aid Scheme. Addressing the Portfolio Committee on the events, the Deputy Minister of Higher Education, Buti Manamela, said a meeting will be set up with the Vice-Chancellor and student leaders. That will be in a bid to try and solve the problem and come up with alternatives. That will be the discussion that happens tonight at Wits between the university and the students. Manamela describes the loss of life at protests as quite unfortunate and unnecessary.
We are trying to find more information so that we extend our condolences to the family. This is quite unfortunate, and obviously we do not encourage or condone in any way situations where, during protest that there is loss of death. We are in contact with the university, with the Vice-Chancellor. We're also trying to get hold of the student leadership so that, the issues are resolved as speedily as possible.
We're a democratic society, we're a democratic country. There's freedom of expression, freedom to protest, legitimate protest, but it has to be peaceful.
Welcome back. On Zoom, I'm joined by the Deputy Head of Advocacy and Organizing at Equal Education from Cape Town, Twaita Wenana, and Dominic Brown. They work in the area of economic justice and they run economic justice programs at the Alternative Information and Development Center. Welcome. Thanks for joining me this evening. Twaita, let's start with you.
Yes. Hello.
Hi, Twaita. You've seen the many cuts in the budget to education. What effect will this have on the right to an education that every child has under our Constitution?
Right. I just want to start by saying that equal education has joined the call by trade unions, civil society, organizations and movements to sort of reject the budget that's put out.
Yeah.
Because it undermines the rights, or the realization of rights for people. Because in order for people to access their rights, there needs to be political and financial backing from the government. But the government has done the opposite, which is take away money from a lot of social services, including basic education. So an example in basic education is that, so over the years, we've seen the deprioritization of e-budget education, but it's not increasing. But in the times of COVID, we have seen budget cuts. To be very exact, is that 2.1 billion was taken away from national budget, but also 1.7 billion was taken away from the infrastructure grants. And that has implications. So the implications is that some infrastructure projects will either be paused or stopped completely. and that there will be sort of a shortage of teachers. And the National Treasury has also sort of agreed in their budget review, Bana, this will have negative learning outcomes because there's a shortage of teachers, but also classroom will not be built. And also scholar transport, where learners are having to travel kilometers to get to school, will not have access to transport because of this budget cuts. So they're devastating, not only because we in the time of COVID, but because we have an unequal education system. And that what that means is that when private schools were able to open and public schools were having to sit and watch in their sidelines, was mainly because of the fact that their schools were not safe to open. And because the infrastructures were not there, the PPEs and the different things that are needed for learning and teaching to be effective in the times of COVID. So the widening gap in the times of COVID has been laid bare to us.
Now, Dominic Brown, can you join us on the score? What effects will the cuts to education have, both on basic education and on higher education? And how does that translate into a human rights issue?
Thank you. So I'd first like to start by saying my deepest condolences to the Ntumbi family. And I think that this life loss brings to bear the impacts of budget cuts and of an austerity agenda. And this budget is, in spite of the misleading things that the parliamentarians are saying, that this is not an austerity budget. It is by definition an austerity budget. And it will and is unconstitutional as we see it, because the massive cuts to spending on education in real terms, massive cuts to spending to healthcare in real terms, and the massive cuts to grants puts people's lives at risk. It puts the lives of the majority of South Africans at risk. And secondly, this policy is self-defeating in that these budget cuts to reduce the debt levels will actually, in the long run, result in a growing level of debt to GDP, because we'll see the cuts will lead to a contraction or a decline in the economy. And just to say, you asked what the impacts of this will be. Now, National Treasury itself recognizes how, and I quote, low compensation growth of 0.8% per year without taking inflation into account over the medium-term framework, combined with early retirement, will reduce the number of teachers. This, coupled with a rising number of learners, implies larger class sizes, especially in no-fee schools, which are the majority of schools in the country. This is expected to negatively affect learning outcomes, just as Kwaita said. So the fact that Treasury can say this in their budget, yet deny that this is austerity, that they can recognize that we've sent this open letter calling on them to reject the budget and to fulfill their constitutional obligations to protect and advance social and economic rights, human rights. The fact that they can just ignore it effectively shows that they are living on another planet. They have no sense of the reality that South Africans are facing. We are in a situation where there's more than 40% unemployment and one of the most unequal countries in the world. We should be taxing the rich, implementing a basic income grant, and providing vaccines for all, and spending on the essential services that is required. And I think that there's lots of money to do this, and I'll speak to that in a bit if I have a chance.
I just wanted to get to Kwaita quickly, to get her to join in a bit. So Kwaita, you were explaining in very helpful, granular ways the impacts on education and educational outcomes. But socioeconomic rights are justiciable. You can go to court, you can litigate, and so on. Is this too costly a route, or why is it that I think universally throughout the human rights movement across the world, there's been a reticence and a hesitance to make economic policy that thing that you go on lawfare about?
Yeah, so it's the whole project that Dominic was alluding to, which is the project of neoliberal austerity, right? And that means that they're putting the rights of abantu over and above the profits. And
yeah, I
say
get
that in education.
Quite, I get that, but what I'm not getting is the hesitancy about raising these issues through the courts, because the Constitutional Court, about which we are talking today, because it is Human Rights Month, gives citizens these rights. I was hoping for some explanations of maybe issues like costs being a barrier, or perhaps knowledge and lack of mobilization around these issues.
Please comment on this.
Okay, please go ahead.
So the issues that you mentioned are part of the reason why there's not enough sort of awareness about what the government is doing, but also that the only weapon that abantu who don't have access to lawyers, who are poor and black, is sort of their right to protest and to express their collective needs and wants. And so that's why the route of protesting has been a way to sort of gain a lot, especially in the public sort of basic education. The reason why there's a law that protects public schools right now is because literally teachers, learners, and parents had to go on the streets to say that there needs to be a law that protects us, that gives us the funding that we need to have better learning and teaching environments. And then at a time when the law was not sort of saying you can do it when it's possible, again, teachers and learners and parents went to Bishop Court to say, Novana, there shouldn't be a loose term. There should be a very clear sort of call to say that they must do it immediately.
We're fast running out of time.
Education is an immediate realizable right.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dominic, I suspect you're going to say something very quickly, because we've run out of minutes, about access to justice. I could sense that you were itching to go.
So we have to explore all avenues possible right now to get this budget turned back. This budget is going to have devastating consequences. The fact that we're going to see cuts at municipal level, cuts to all essential services, means we're going to see more protests and more violence from the state in response to it.
Oh dear, I pray not. I sincerely pray not.
There are real alternatives, and the fact is that unfortunately, or actually fortunately, we have a separation of powers where the judiciary doesn't want to impede on the rights of the executive and the legislature. However,
unfortunately, I have to cut you off there. We have sincerely run out of time. This is where we have to leave it for tonight.
We have to reject this budget. That's all I want to conclude on. Everyone must reject this budget. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. The policy choices made by governments around the world and other powerful actors mark the difference between a life of dignity and one of deprivation and injustice for literally billions of people around the world. Despite these facts, the human rights movement has until recently been rather hesitant to grapple with the political, contentious field of economic policy. However, that's now going to change. And soon, very often, we will hear the words of the preamble uttered. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffer for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. Good night, Mzansi. Khona ndini mawethu.